Peaceful days shattered. Harlan, Michigan was the sort of town most people imagined when they thought of small-town America. Nestled in a quiet valley surrounded by vast forests and clear lakes, Harlan was home to just under 5,000 people. The streets were lined with quaint clapboard houses, American flags draped proudly over porch railings. There was one diner where coffee brewed steadily from dawn to dusk, a barber shop where the older men gathered to talk about the local high school football team, and a main street that seemed frozen in time, echoing with the laughter of children playing tag in the long summer evenings. For decades, life in this town had unfolded in predictable ways. 4th of July parades filled the streets with fireworks and marching bands. Sunday mornings were reserved for church services before families returned home for barbecues in neatly mowed backyards. Neighbors waved to each other in passing, even if they didn't have much to say. It wasn't fancy, and it wasn't exciting, but Harlan was safe, reliable, and untouched by the chaos of the outside world. That all changed in the summer of 1991. It began as a season drenched in nostalgia. The school year had ended and teenagers cycled down the streets while their younger siblings chased fireflies at dusk, their shrieks of delight mingling with the croak of bullfrogs from the nearby creeks. But alongside the idyllic scenes of American suburbia, a darker, unseen tension brewed. Like storm clouds building over the horizon, most didn't notice the shift, at least, not at first. Adam Hayes had lived in Harlan his entire life. His father had worked as a mechanic, his mother stayed home, and young Adam grew up as any other boy might in Harlan, playing Little League, riding his bike aimlessly under the bright blue sky, and dreaming vaguely of leaving town for bigger, better things. But things took a turn when his mother died unexpectedly when Adam was just 13. Left with his grieving father and a sense of emptiness no one seemed to address, Adam began to feel like the world was something he no longer fit into. By the time he was in his late teens, whispers about Adam had already begun to surface, the kind that floated through towns like Harlan, where gossip moved faster than facts. He had a temper, people said. He kept to himself too much. Quiet and a little odd, he didn't seem like one of their own anymore. Still, no one ever imagined the Hayes boy could be dangerous. Then came the night that shattered everything. July 4th, 1991. Fireworks lit up the sky above Harlan's green spaces while neighbors gathered in lawn chairs to watch the display. If someone had noticed Adam Hayes walking alone down Sycamore Avenue, hands shoved into his jacket pockets despite the warm air, they didn't find anything unusual about it. Plenty of locals strolled that night, a beer in one hand, a sparkler in the other. But Adam wasn't headed toward the park to see the fireworks. He had other plans, the kind born from years of frustration and anger quietly simmering beneath the surface. When the first gunshot echoed through the night, it went unnoticed by most. Surely it was just a firework. But then came another sound, and another. Sharp cracks that didn't fade into colorful bursts in the sky. Gasps and screams soon replaced the sound of laughter and celebration, as the realization sunk in. Real bullets were flying through Harlan. By the end of the night, the streets of this once idyllic town bore the scars of an evil no one had thought possible. Blood stained the sidewalks. Porch lights that had glowed warmly now illuminated scenes of devastation. 18 lives were lost before Adam was finally apprehended after a tense standoff in the woods. And just like that, Harlan transformed. From a postcard image of American dreaminess into the setting of one of the most horrifying mass killings in the state's history. Harlan would never be the same after that night. Families would no longer leave their doors unlocked. Strangers would no longer be welcomed in so casually. The town's sense of safety was not just shattered, it was obliterated. And for years to come, people would ask the same question: how did someone like Adam Hayes, a boy from their town, become a monster capable of such brutality? A twisted bond and misguided feelings. Catherine Moore had always been the heartbeat of Sycamore Street. Known for her effortless charm and generous heart, she was the kind of neighbor everyone in Harlan wished for. Her backyard barbecues were legendary, her brownies were the highlight of any church potluck, and when anyone needed help, Catherine was already at their door before the request was voiced. Adam Hayes knew her as the warm, smiling woman who lived 2 doors down, a beacon of kindness in the years after his mother's untimely death. Adam was only 13 when his mother passed away, leaving his father a widower, and their home a vacuum of sorrow. Catherine, noticing the despair that clung to the Hayes household like a heavy fog, had stepped in without hesitation. She brought over casseroles when there was nothing but fast food on their kitchen table, and offered to watch Adam while his father worked late shifts at the auto repair shop. For a teenage boy grappling with grief, Catherine became more than a friendly neighbor. She became a guide, a confidant, and in many ways, a maternal figure. "Hey kiddo, you all right?" she had asked one evening when Adam lingered on her front porch longer than usual. He shrugged, the weight of the world evident in his hunched shoulders. Catherine didn't press. Instead, she handed him a glass of lemonade and sat with him on the porch swing, matching his silence with her presence. In those quiet moments, Catherine didn't just fill a void, she painted a picture of what kindness could look like. Adam, a boy who had felt invisible in his own home, suddenly had someone who saw him. But as the years passed, something shifted. What had started as a simple neighborly affection began to warp in ways neither of them could have anticipated or wanted to confront. By the time Adam turned 17, his admiration for Catherine evolved into something deeper, more confusing. She wasn't just the cheerful neighbor who baked cookies anymore. To him, she became mesmerizing. Catherine, with her auburn hair tied casually into a bun, her laughter echoing lightly across the street, and her easy confidence, represented everything warmth and stability in Adam's fractured world. He didn't know how to navigate the feelings swirling inside him, but he did know that being around her made him feel safe, alive, and wanted in ways nothing else could. Catherine, on the other hand, remained blissfully unaware of Adam's growing fascination. To her, he was still the same shy neighborhood boy she'd taken under her wing. While Adam was tall for his age, with the broad shoulders of a young man, she still saw the shadow of the scrawny boy who had cried into her arms after his mom's funeral. Catherine never noticed how his gaze lingered longer than necessary, or how he timed his bike rides to cross her path more often than coincidental. Summer evenings became a ritual for Adam. From the steps of his house, he watched Catherine hang laundry in her backyard or water her rose garden. When she stopped to wave at him, his heart would race in a way that confused and thrilled him. These innocent moments, at least to Catherine, became lifelines for Adam, moments he replayed endlessly in his mind. As his feelings intensified, his perception became more distorted. Every kind interaction, every smile, every casual joke, every hand on his shoulder, felt like an unspoken promise. He convinced himself she cared for him in ways she couldn't express, ways that went beyond simple neighborly affection. While most teenage crushes fade with time, Adam's didn't. Instead, it deepened, fueled by his loneliness and the quiet intensity with which he attached himself to her. By the time he was 20, Adam began rationalizing the gap in their ages. If people like Patrick Swayze could have love stories with older women in Hollywood, why couldn't he? In his mind, he wasn't an awkward young man with misplaced emotions. He was a romantic hero fighting for a bond that transcended societal norms. Meanwhile, Catherine's life went on. She had her own struggles, raising 2 kids, juggling PTA meetings, and supporting her husband Pete through his ups and downs as a contractor. It was a life Adam idealized from afar, imagining himself seamlessly stepping in to replace Pete. His fantasies painted Catherine as trapped in a marriage she didn't truly want, waiting for someone to rescue her. That someone, in Adam's mind, was him. The moment of confession came one humid July evening. Catherine had invited Adam over for dinner, as she sometimes did when Pete was working late. She loved his company. It reminded her of her nephews, playful and grateful for her cooking. Out on the patio, under the glow of string lights and the faint hum of crickets, Adam saw his chance. He cleared his throat, his palms clammy with nervous anticipation. "Catherine," he began, his voice trembling as he struggled to meet her eyes. "Can I tell you something? Something I've been meaning to say for a long time?" She glanced at him, her expression amused but kind. "Of course, Adam, you can tell me anything." I love you," he blurted out. The words spilled out faster than he anticipated, fueled by years of bottled-up emotion. "Not like a neighbor or even a friend. I mean, I'm in love with you." For a brief moment, the world seemed to freeze. Catherine blinked, the weight of his words sinking in. Then she laughed softly, a laugh that cut Adam deeper than any harsh word could have. He flinched. "Oh, Adam, that's sweet, but that's impossible. You're just a kid and I'm married with children, you know that, right?" Her words hit him like a tidal wave. Every fantasy, every plan he had built in his mind came crashing down. "No, Catherine, I'm serious," he insisted, tears welling up in his eyes. "Pete doesn't love you the way I do. I could take care of you. I've thought about it. We could make it work." Catherine's smile faded. Guilt replaced amusement as she realized the depth of Adam's feelings. Choosing her words carefully, she said, "Adam, you're young. What you're feeling now, it's confusion, not love. It would be best if we didn't talk about this again. You have to understand how wrong this is." The rejection was swift, but it wasn't harsh. Catherine wanted to spare his feelings, but her gentle dismissal left Adam with a deeper wound, a wound that would fester and grow in the shadows of his mind. In the days that followed, Catherine began to create distance, hoping to ease Adam out of his infatuation, but the damage was done. For her, it was a heartbreakingly awkward moment with a boy she cared about deeply, but not in any romantic way. For Adam, it was betrayal. Proof that even Catherine, the one person he had placed all his faith in, could hurt him like everyone else. This rejection marked the turning point for Adam Hayes. What could have been a fleeting adolescent crush curdled into something darker, a silent rage that would eventually consume the peaceful town of Harlan. Disaster set in motion by a confession. It happened on a quiet evening in late July, after a long stretch of humid, sweltering days where the air felt so heavy that even the cicadas seemed to sing in slow motion. Catherine Moore had just set down a fresh glass of iced tea on her porch, her favorite chair creaking gently under her as she kicked off her sandals. In the fading glow of a paper lantern swinging lazily from the rafters above, she gave a tired but contented sigh. Her husband Pete was away on an extended job and both of her teenage sons were out at a friend's house. She was alone, savoring the silence, at least for a few minutes. That was when Adam Hayes appeared, walking hesitantly up the cracked sidewalk that connected her front yard to the worn streets of Harlan. His lanky frame seemed out of place in the dimming light. He had his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jeans, his head down, but his shoulders rigid with determination. Even before he reached her porch, Catherine could tell something was bothering him. Adam wasn't the kind of boy who dropped by unannounced, at least not anymore. Years ago, when his mom had passed, she'd been used to him hanging around, looking for a meal or a little attention, and she'd gladly given both. But recently, Catherine had noticed he rarely stopped in, which she assumed was just part of him getting older. "Adam?" Catherine called out as she spotted him, leaning forward in her chair. She smiled, putting on her best welcoming tone. "Didn't expect to see you tonight." He looked up, hesitant. "Hi, Catherine," he replied, his voice tight, almost breaking. "Everything okay, hun? You look like you've got something heavy on your mind," she said, her warmth genuine. She stood up, motioning to the swing just a few feet from her. "Why don't you sit down and tell me about it? Pete's gone, and I could use the company anyway." Adam nodded stiffly but hesitated before climbing the steps to join her on the porch. He wiped his hands nervously on the sides of his jeans just as he always did when he was anxious. Catherine waited, holding her drink in both hands but keeping her attention fully on him. After a moment of silence, he blurted out, "I need to say something. Something important, Catherine." The way he said her name this time, so heavy and deliberate, made her sit up straighter. "Okay," she said cautiously, trying to gauge where this was going. Adam stood, pacing back and forth across the wooden slats of the porch. His shoes scuffed against the worn boards as he struggled to find his words. Finally he stopped abruptly and turned to face her. His face was red, his fists clenched at his sides. "I love you," he said in a rush, as though getting the words out before they swallowed him whole. "I've been in love with you for years." Catherine blinked, taken completely off guard. Of all the things she had expected, maybe a story about trouble at work or a fight with his dad, this was nowhere on her radar. At first, she thought he must be joking. When she realized he wasn't, her heart sank. "Adam," she said carefully, sitting the glass of tea down on the small table beside her. "Honey, I don't quite think you mean what you're saying. You're confused. I'm your neighbor, someone who's watched you grow up." "No," he interrupted, his voice wavering but growing firmer as he spoke. "I mean it. I mean every word. I love you, Catherine. I've loved you since, I don't know, forever. And I know this might be a shock to you, but it doesn't matter how old we are or what anyone else thinks. I'll take care of you. Pete doesn't treat you the way you deserve. I know that. I could be better for you. We could be happy." Catherine's jaw tightened as his words sank in. This was no fleeting teenage crush. It was something far deeper, far more misplaced. And that scared her. She stood up, shaking her head, searching for the right response to let him down gently without crushing him. "Adam," she began softly, her tone kind but steady. That's a sweet thing to say, but it's not right. It's not the kind of love you think it is. And even if it was, Pete's my husband, I love my family. You're part of this community and I've cared about you like I care about my boys, but this, what you're talking about, it's just not possible, it's not real." Tears welled in his eyes and his voice cracked. "It feels real to me. Every time you smiled at me or called me over or made me feel like I mattered, You don't know how much that meant to me. No one else ever made me feel that way." She hesitated, the guilt already blooming in her chest, but she forced herself to stay firm. "I never meant to make you feel this way inappropriately, Adam. Maybe I wasn't careful enough about how I acted around you. But that doesn't mean this is something that can be..." "Why not?" His voice rose slightly, pushing against the boundaries of what he'd kept buried for so long. "If you really cared about me, you'd give us a chance." Her tone hardened, almost instinctively. "That's enough, Adam. This conversation is over. I'm going to pretend this never happened. You're young. You're confused. You'll look back on this someday and realize it wasn't what you thought it was." Adam's face darkened, his hands clenched tighter, the tears now streaming freely down his cheeks. "You don't understand. You don't care at all." "Adam!" she snapped, more forcefully this time. "Stop! Go home! And don't you ever bring this up again!" Her sharp words cut him deeper than she intended, but she knew she had no choice. She needed to end this and put space between them, for her sake and his. Adam's mouth opened as if to argue, but he froze. His entire expression shifted from anger to disbelief to pain. He turned abruptly and stormed down the steps, shoving his hands into his pockets again as he disappeared into the shadows. Catherine's heart pounded as she watched him go. She felt guilty for being so harsh, but what else could she have said? She shook her head, whispering to herself, "What just happened?" Meanwhile, Adam walked quickly back to his empty home, simmering with emotions he could no longer control: rejection, humiliation, anger, and something darker, something more dangerous. By the time he reached his front door, the shy, sensitive boy Catherine had known seemed to disappear completely. What replaced him was something unpredictable, fueled by a broken heart and a mind twisting further away from reason with every step. That moment on Catherine's porch was the tipping point, the singular event that set everything in motion. By sharing his emotions and hearing her rejection, Adam Hayes, a boy once full of longing for hope and connection, began his descent into the darkest chapter of Harlan's history. Gossip spreads like wildfire. By the time the weekend rolled around, the streets of Harlan, Michigan weren't buzzing with the usual chatter of who bought a new car, or which kid made the varsity football team. Instead, they simmered with whispers about Adam Hayes and Catherine Moore. Like wildfire, the story had ignited, sparked by a careless overheard comment, and fanned by the relentless gossip machinery of small-town America. It started innocently enough. Mrs. Patterson, the self-appointed watchdog of Sycamore Avenue, had been trimming her rose bushes when she noticed Adam storming off Catherine's porch a few nights earlier, his face red, his shoulders hunched, his hands jammed into the pockets of his jeans. From the darkened window of her living room, Mrs. Patterson thought she saw Catherine follow him to the edge of her porch, visibly shaken. It wasn't much, but in a place like Harlan, it was enough. "Did you see Adam and Catherine the other night?" Mrs. Patterson asked her friend Connie Miller the next morning while passing her at the farmer's market. "I swear it looked like he was yelling at her. And Catherine, she looked flustered, maybe even upset. You think something's going on there?" Had Connie Miller simply rolled her eyes and walked away, perhaps the story would have ended there. But Connie, whose curiosity sometimes got the better of her, couldn't resist mentioning it to her sister-in-law over brunch. By the time the eggs and bacon came out, what had been a vague observation had grown into a juicy bit of speculation. "I heard Adam Hayes lost his temper with Catherine Moore the other night," Connie said, her tone conspiratorial. "He's been acting weird for years, hasn't he? I bet he's got some sort of obsession with her." Her sister-in-law raised an arched brow. "You mean like, that kind of obsession? No, Catherine's married. And Adam's just a kid." But the words had been spoken, and like a dropped match on dry kindling, they ignited. Within days, the story had taken on a life of its own. By the time word reached the diner on Main Street, a hub for both caffeine and rumors, it had completely spiraled out of control. "Did you hear?" one of the waitresses whispered to Edna, a local who came in every morning for black coffee and toast. "People are saying Adam Hayes was trying to... well, let's just say it wasn't very neighborly, what he was trying to do with Catherine Moore. Poor woman. Her husband's out of town half the time. She must not have known what to say to him." Over the clatter of dishes and hiss of the coffee machine, Edna leaned in closer. "Are you telling me Adam stepped out of bounds with Catherine? That's disgusting. She's old enough to be his mom." The waitress shrugged dramatically. "I don't know exactly, but I heard one of the Patterson boys saw it too. Crazy, huh? Boy's got some nerve." Edna shook her head disapprovingly. I always knew there was something off about that boy. Quiet types like him are the ones you gotta keep an eye on. From that moment on, every interaction, every glance, and every gesture between Adam and Catherine, past and present, was reinterpreted through a darker lens as the residents of Harlan concocted their own versions of the story. Some claimed Adam had been sneaking onto Catherine's property for months, watching her through her windows. Others insisted they'd overheard Catherine complaining about Adam's inappropriate behavior to a friend at church, a complete fabrication. The most salacious rumors painted an even darker picture. By the time the story reached Sullivan's gas station, one local claimed, Adam and Catherine were caught, together, right there on her porch by the Tanners. Of course, the Tanners, the supposed witnesses, hadn't seen anything of the sort. But that small detail didn't stop the tale from spreading like gospel. Nowhere was the gossip more relentless than at the local barber shop, where older men gathered daily to dissect the latest buzz over the rhythmic snip of scissors. "Did you ever hear about Adam's mom? Died young, didn't she?" one of the regulars mused, combing through what little he knew of Adam's troubled background. "Boy grew up without a mom and probably started looking at Catherine like she was some kind of replacement. Only, well, maybe he crossed some lines." "Crossed some lines?" another man interjected, his voice dripping with mock outrage. "That kid's a damn ticking time bomb! Always knew there was something not quite right about him." Even at church, a place meant for charity and forgiveness, the congregation buzzed with murmurs of scandal. Catherine's behavior, once lauded as neighborly and kind, was suddenly scrutinized. More than one parishioner suggested she might have been too nice to Adam, unintentionally inviting his attention. "She's a good woman," someone said during coffee hour, "but you gotta wonder, if he did get the wrong idea, what on earth could she have done to lead him on?" None of it was true, not even close. But in a town like Harlan, truth had little bearing on gossip. The more dramatic and shocking the story, the faster it traveled. By the end of the week, Adam couldn't set foot in the grocery store without hearing whispers trail behind him. Neighbors who had once waved at him now looked the other way. At the clinic where Catherine volunteered on weekends, she noticed suspicious glances from other staff members, and the cautious sideways looks from town mothers she'd known for years. The weight of the rumors pushed Adam deep into isolation. He stayed inside, rarely leaving his house except for work, and he avoided Sycamore Avenue altogether. Each whisper he overheard in passing, each smirk that faded when he glanced toward a group of people, added fuel to the fire of his anguish. For someone like Adam, who had already carried years of rejection and loneliness, this sudden rejection from an entire town felt unbearable. Catherine bore her own share of the fallout. Though she tried to go about her days as usual, the questions, the whispers, and the occasional lingering stares followed her like a shadow. Pete, her husband, hadn't heard the rumors yet. He was away on a job site in Indiana. But Catherine knew it was only a matter of time before the gossip reached him, twisting something harmless into something catastrophic. She resolved to keep her distance from Adam, thinking space would settle things. But the damage was already done. Harlan, once a haven of quiet, predictable life, had become a pressure cooker of judgment and suspicion. For Adam, the rejection he now faced wasn't just personal, it was public, humiliating, and inescapable. He was no longer just the town oddball, he was the subject of their most salacious gossip, and in the weeks ahead, the weight of that gossip would prove too much to bear. Tensions reach a breaking point. By late August, Harlan, Michigan, felt like it was holding its breath. The scorching summer sun continued to beat down mercilessly, making tempers shorter and shadows longer. For Adam Hayes, the town had become a prison of eyes, not the physical kind but the kind that followed, stared, and whispered behind your back. Everywhere Adam turned, he could feel those sharp, probing glances boring into his skin. The gossip, once a quiet murmur, had grown into a roar. It was no longer confined to Sycamore Avenue or the barber shop. Now it seemed like the entire town had an opinion about the Hayes boy. Whether he was shopping for groceries, sitting alone in a booth at the diner, or walking to work at the hardware store, silence followed him like a shadow. No one spoke to him directly, but the smirks, the hushed snickers as he walked past, were screams in his ears. At work it wasn't much better. His co-workers had started avoiding him, no longer inviting him to join their lunch breaks by the loading dock. Danny, his shift supervisor, once a friendly face who stayed after hours to teach Adam the ropes when he was younger, now avoided eye contact altogether. One Tuesday afternoon as Adam restocked nails and screws in aisle 6, A customer walked past with her teenage daughter. She glanced at Adam and whispered something under her breath to the girl, who turned wide, curious eyes toward him. That was the final straw. Adam dropped the box of screws onto the shelf with a loud clatter and stormed to the back room, ignoring Danny's weak attempts to get his attention. A few hours later, Danny pulled him aside. "Look, Adam," he said, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "I don't know what's going on with you, but maybe you should take a day or two off, clear your head." "You think I'm the problem, don't you?" Adam shot back, his voice rising unexpectedly. "You're all against me anyway. Don't even try to pretend you're not. I know what you people say about me." Danny blinked, startled. "Adam, nobody's against you," he said quickly, more out of reflex than genuine reassurance. Look, just get some rest, okay? I think you're overthinking things." Adam didn't argue further. He just nodded stiffly and walked out, leaving his time card untouched by the punch clock. Back home, the silence of Adam's small house was oppressive. The once comforting hum of the fridge in the kitchen only reminded him of how empty everything felt. The couch, sagging and faded from years of wear, seemed to mock him. It had been his mother's favorite spot, and now it sat as lifeless as everything else in the house. Adam tried to distract himself, watching reruns of TV shows, flipping aimlessly through magazines he didn't even care about. But no matter what he did, the weight of the town's judgment pressed down on him like chains wrapped tight around his chest. Everywhere he looked, there were reminders of what he'd lost, real or imagined. The memories of Catherine stung the most. He could still see her standing on her porch telling him to leave, her tone growing sharp as she ended their conversation for good. What hurt wasn't just her rejection, it was how easy she had made it seem. She'd dismissed him as if his emotions were something trivial, something she could discard without a second thought. How could she do that to him when she was the only person who'd ever shown him real kindness? Adam found himself pacing around the small living room at night, muttering to himself. His mind fractured into spiraling loops of resentment and anger. He rolled her words over and over in his head like rocks in a tumbler, his rage growing sharper with each turn. The whispers from the town, Catherine's rejection, it was all connected in his mind, one blistering knot of betrayal. Meanwhile, the tension in Harlan kept rising. Catherine had hoped that distancing herself from Adam would quiet the rumors, but it seemed to have the opposite effect. In fact, her silence fueled new layers of speculation. Some residents began questioning why she wasn't addressing the rumors directly. "She's keeping too quiet," said Mrs. Patterson one evening at her book club. "If there wasn't something to those stories, don't you think she'd be shouting it from the rooftops?" Connie Miller, flipping through the pages of the book they were supposed to be discussing, nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, silence only makes you look guiltier if you ask me." The group chuckled in agreement, moving seamlessly from the topic of 19th-century novels to picking apart Catherine's reputation. For her part, Catherine tried to keep life as normal as possible. She wasn't going to let the town dictate how she lived, but the strain was beginning to show. She avoided the grocery store and started pulling her kids from after-school activities earlier, keeping her family closer to home. Pete, finally catching wind of the gossip, dismissed it all as nonsense, brushing it off with an irritated wave of his hand. But the same couldn't be said for Catherine. She could feel the subtle shifts around her every time she walked into the church lobby or the diner, the eyes that darted away too quickly, the half-smiles that didn't quite reach people's faces. Still, Catherine didn't fully grasp the storm brewing inside Adam. For Adam, things had reached a boiling point. No longer did he see Harlan as his home. It was hostile territory. Every house, every porch, every smiling face he passed seemed like part of some larger conspiracy targeting him. His growing paranoia clouded his thoughts, turning his once quiet resentment into a steady drumbeat of anger. He stopped going to work altogether after his fight with Danny. His evenings were spent alone in his room, flipping through the sketchpad he once used for doodling comic book heroes he'd dreamed of creating. Now those pages were filled with grim scrawls of dark figures, shadows looming over town hall, fires engulfing the church, faces twisted in screams. "They'll see," Adam whispered to himself during one of those nights. He repeated phrases like mantras, words meant to reassure himself, but that echoed with a dangerous edge. "They pushed me out. They'll be sorry. They'll know what they did." The boiling fury inside him wasn't just about Catherine anymore. It was about the entire town. They'd all laughed at him, humiliated him, rejected him, and in Adam's twisted, spiraling thoughts, they had to pay. Across Sycamore Avenue, Catherine still kept her porch light on every night, a small but comforting beacon in the neighborhood. She had no idea that, just a few doors down, Adam sat in his dimly lit living room staring out the window toward her house, His shoulders twitched as he clenched and unclenched his fists, his breathing sharp and uneven. This was the moment, the calm before the storm began to crack. The powder keg had been set, and the only thing missing was the spark. A plot for revenge takes shape. By the end of August, the sweltering summer air in Harlan seemed heavier, stifling even the rhythm of the town. But for Adam Hayes, that heat had nothing to do with the weather. His every waking moment now burned with anger, humiliation, and rejection. The once shy, reserved young man who had walked Harlan's tree-lined streets was gone, swallowed wholly by a growing shadow of paranoia and hatred. Alone in his small, dimly lit house, Adam did the one thing he believed was left for him to do: plan vengeance. Not just on Catherine, not just on a few people, but on all of Harlan. Adam's rage wasn't impulsive. It simmered, calculated, and deliberate. Each rejection and rumor over the last few months replayed in his mind on an endless loop. Catherine's strained smile as she dismissed him, the people pointedly avoiding him on Main Street, the whispers at the diner he was certain were about him. He saw their faces in his mind, rearranging their smiles into sneers, their laughter into taunts. They all thought I was nothing. And now, Adam convinced himself he had to remind them, forcefully, that he was something they couldn't ignore. It began one sleepless night, the kind that seemed bred from guilt and fury, combining in a dark churn. Sitting on the edge of his worn-out bed, Adam stared at the floorboards as if the answers to his humiliation were hidden in the grooves. His house was eerily silent except for the faint buzz of a ceiling fan he hadn't turned off since June. It was his only companion during his long nights of brooding isolation. "They're never going to stop," he muttered to himself, his voice cracking under the weight of his thoughts. "They'll keep staring, whispering, pretending I'm not worth anything. It's all of them, not just her, all of them." His jaw tightened as the intensity of what he was thinking began to solidify. The idea of getting back at everyone wasn't just a fleeting impulse anymore. It felt like clarity. He didn't feel like a villain in these moments. No, in Adam's warped mind, this was justice. Catherine had rejected him cruelly. The town had laughed behind his back. They had pushed him out, dragged his name through the mud, made him a pariah. Now it was their turn to feel small, helpless. Now they'd know how deep their rejection had left its scars. The next morning, Adam sat at the kitchen table, where fragments of his life were scattered like a puzzle no one wanted to solve. Empty coffee mugs sat beside unopened mail. Even a dusty photo frame of his late mother had been pushed aside, as if her once soothing presence now held no comfort for him. His notebook, which used to be a space for sketches and the occasional sloppy attempt at writing short stories, had been erased of whimsy. Its pages were now filled with meticulous planning, names, addresses, routes through the streets of Harlan. Early sketches in the notebook had contained vague grievances, lists of people he felt had wronged him, terse sentences like "Catherine lied" or "Danny thinks I'm pathetic." But lately those notes had shifted toward actions, ideas, and something darker. Adam began listing places people gathered, best times to avoid being seen, even methods of striking that would make the most noise. The anger that he could barely control was being harnessed into systemic thought, one scribbled page at a time. Adam's first real step toward action came on a sweltering Friday when he drove one town over to a dingy pawn shop that didn't ask many questions. Adam had done his research. The owner, a chain-smoking man with graying sideburns, didn't blink when Adam asked to see the firearms. "You know how to use one of these?" the man asked, sliding a modest pistol across the counter. Its dark, polished barrel seemed impossibly heavy in Adam's trembling hands. "Yeah, I've used some before," Adam lied, his voice quieter than he had intended. He didn't want to sound nervous or out of place. He needed this man to believe he was just another unsettled small-town guy looking to protect himself, nothing more. The owner narrowed his eyes but shrugged after counting the cash Adam handed over. "There's paperwork and all, but I don't ask too many questions if you know what I mean," he said with a dry chuckle, tapping ashes into a beer can behind the counter. Adam nodded tightly, shoving the gun into his backpack and quickly leaving without a word. That night back home, he carefully unwrapped the weapon on his kitchen table, staring at it for what felt like hours. The cold steel reflected the dim flickering light bulb overhead, its hollow barrel both thrilling and terrifying to him. His hands were clammy as he gripped it, imagining for the first time not what might happen if he used it, but what would happen. Adam's preparation didn't stop there. Over the next week he bought ammunition and a second handgun through equally discreet channels. He spent hours walking the length of Sycamore Avenue, memorizing the positions of porch lights, understanding the sight lines of each house. He avoided familiar places like the hardware store or the diner, knowing even casual encounters might risk unraveling his plan. He didn't trust himself to keep calm if someone sneered at him or muttered as he passed. And besides, there seemed to be no room left in his thoughts for daily life anymore. This, his plan, was all that existed now. When Adam wasn't pacing inside his house or replaying Catherine's rejection in his head, he worked on maps, sketching layouts of key locations on napkins and the back pages of his notebook. The park where the 4th of July fireworks were held, the diner parking lot, Sycamore Avenue. He circled places where he could disappear into the woods if needed, places where he knew the police might hesitate to follow. Adam also rehearsed, standing alone in his backyard, shielded by the overgrown bushes that had been left untended for months. He practiced drawing the gun, holding it steady, aiming at imaginary faces and ideas. He whispered to himself as he moved through crude simulations in his mind, clumsy but determined, giving orders to people who weren't there, demanding apologies from invisible versions of his tormentors. Though Adam had lost track of the days, the 4th of July festival loomed ahead like a twisted beacon. It was perfect, he reasoned. The streets would be filled with people who had judged him, rejected him, laughed at him behind his back. The fireworks would mask the sound of gunfire, at least at first. And then, one by one, they would see the price of their cruelty. His bitterness now outweighed any lingering hesitation he might have had. They brought this on themselves, he muttered one night, staring out his window at the warm glow of Catherine's porch light. That light, once a symbol of comfort and kindness, now mocked him. It was still there, still shining, while everything inside him had burned away. For Adam, there was no turning back. He had convinced himself that this wasn't just an act of revenge, it was justice. And as his plans solidified, the quaint, quiet streets of Harlan remained blissfully unaware that the young man they had cast aside was deciding their fate, one list, one map, and one bullet at a time. The killing spree begins. The evening of July 4th arrived with all the hallmark sounds and scents of summer, a chorus of laughter rising from backyard barbecues, the fizz of sparklers being lit by excited children, and the distant boom of fireworks echoing through the hills surrounding Harlan. The town had come alive, its small streets glittering under strings of red, white, and blue lights. For most, it was a night of tradition, joy, and celebration. But for Adam Hayes, it was the culmination of everything he'd been plotting, the moment he'd long rehearsed in his mind. He stood in the shadow of his small front porch, dressed in a dark hoodie and jeans, the bulge of 2 handguns hidden inside his jacket. Hands trembling slightly, he stared down Sycamore Avenue. Catherine's house sat only a few doors away, her worn porch lit with that warm, familiar glow. Even now, that light mocked him, bright and constant, untouched by the rejection and betrayal he'd felt. Adam had spent days going over every detail of his plan. He knew the 4th of July would bring most people out of their homes. Families would fill the narrow sidewalks, gathering at the central square for the firework display that would begin just after sundown. The commotion, the noise, it was the perfect cover. He would make them pay for every whisper, every sneer, every time they turned their backs on him. And Catherine, she would understand his pain in the only way he could make her feel it. When the first firework burst across the sky, a brilliant cascade of gold and purple, Adam set out. He moved with purpose, his pace quick and deliberate, his heart pounding in his chest. The sidewalks were crowded with couples and kids, the air electric with holiday cheer. He kept his head low, avoiding eye contact, though his height and hunched shoulders made him hard to miss. His first destination was Catherine's house. Inside, Catherine Moore was busy tidying up after a small neighborhood gathering. A few friends had stopped by earlier in the evening, sharing drinks and laughter on her porch while her 2 children played in the yard. Her husband Pete, still out of town for a job in Indiana, had called briefly to wish her a happy 4th. It had been a quiet but pleasant day, until the doorbell rang. Catherine frowned, her hands still wet from rinsing a glass. She wasn't expecting anyone. The kids were in the den, sprawled out on the floor, watching the fireworks through the window. Wiping her hands on a kitchen towel, she headed to the front door. She opened it and froze. "Adam?" she said, her voice tinged with both surprise and unease. He was standing on the porch, his face partially hidden in the shadows cast by the porch light. "Can I come in?" he asked flatly, not waiting for an answer before stepping over the threshold. Catherine instinctively took a step back, Something about his tone, his posture, sent a chill racing up her spine. "Adam, now's not really a good time," she said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. "The kids are here and—" "Pete's not," Adam interrupted, his voice sharp. His eyes locked on hers, dark and unblinking. "You told me to go, remember? That night. You made me leave. And now you're just sitting here, like nothing ever happened. Like I don't matter. Adam, I don't understand. You don't get it, do you?" His voice cracked, rising with each word. "I gave you everything I had left, everything, and you just tossed me aside like garbage." Catherine's breath quickened as she registered the glint of metal under his jacket when he moved. A gun. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She had to tread carefully. "Adam, listen to me," she began, stepping slightly to the side, angling herself between him and the den where her children sat unaware. "I never wanted to hurt you. If I did anything to make you feel this way, I'm sorry. Truly. But it doesn't have to be like this. Just, let's talk, okay? We'll figure this out." But Adam wasn't listening. His grip tightened on the weapon hidden in his jacket, his knuckles white. The memories of her rejection and the months of humiliation that followed burned behind his eyes like a blazing fire. "No," he said, shaking his head violently. "No more talking. You had your chance. You all did." He drew the gun, the metal catching the light for one fleeting second before Catherine reacted. "Adam, no!" she screamed, her voice a desperate cry that pierced the night. But it was too late. The sharp crack of a gunshot echoed through the house, mingling with the distant booms of fireworks outside. Catherine fell to the floor, clutching her chest where warm blood already began seeping through her fingers. In the den her children froze, their laughter dying instantly, replaced with wide-eyed terror. The younger one screamed, scrambling behind the couch. The older child, trembling and pale, ran toward the front door, straight into Adam's path. The boy slammed into him but wasn't strong enough to knock him off balance. Panicked, he turned to flee, but Adam raised the gun with unflinching precision. Another shot rang out, leaving only silence in its wake. Outside, the neighborhood had yet to notice what had begun. The sound of the gunfire was drowned out by the holiday noise, the sizzling pop of firecrackers, the murmured hum of conversation. Adam stepped back out into the night, his hands streaked with blood, his breath heavy but measured. This was only the beginning. Pivoting down Sycamore Avenue, he began heading toward the central square where the rest of the town was gathered, his mind laser-focused, his rage now fully unleashed. As Adam disappeared into the blinking lights of festivity, Catherine's porch light, its warm glow now stained with blood, continued to shine into the night. It was no longer a beacon of kindness, but the first marker of a tragedy that would soon claim many more lives. Next targets, the gossip spreaders. The blood on Sycamore Avenue was still fresh when Adam Hayes moved on to his next targets. The 4th of July fireworks were now booming in full, painting the night sky with flashes of red, white, and gold. The streets buzzed with laughter and celebration, none of it aware of the violence that had just unfolded at Catherine Moore's house, or the horror that was about to spread further. Adam walked briskly, his head down, his hands gripping the weapons concealed in his jacket. Each step sliced through the summer air, as if the purpose driving him could no longer be weighed down by hesitation or remorse. His face was tense, his mind spinning. Catherine was only the beginning. She had rejected him, yes, but the town was the one that had humiliated him, tearing him apart piece by piece. The gossip spreaders, the whispers and smirks, deliberate or not, they had turned him into a monster in their minds. Now he was ready to show them what that monster looked like. His mental list of names and faces guided him through the streets like a dark compass. Mrs. Patterson, the queen of porch gossip. Connie Miller, always wagging her tongue at the diner. Edna, who had repeated lies about Catherine to anyone willing to listen. The list wasn't random. Adam had cataloged them over weeks of torment, noting every side-eye glare, every faint smile that vanished too quickly when he turned around, every smirk that cut into him like a blade. Tonight was their reckoning. The first stop was Mrs. Patterson's house. Her porch light flickered like a weak firefly competing with the brilliance of the fireworks above. Her prized rose bushes framed the walkway, their blooms sagging slightly under the humidity of the night. Inside she reclined comfortably in her living room, obliviously fiddling with her knitting needles as the distant sound of fireworks lulled her into a sense of calm. Mrs. Patterson had no idea that the Hayes boy, the same one she gossiped about while trimming her roses, was watching her through the window, his face shadowed and still. Adam didn't knock. He didn't wait. The front door hadn't been locked. Of course it wasn't. This was Harlan, the kind of town where people left their doors open, resting on a belief that nothing bad ever really happened here. Adam pushed the door open with slow deliberation, the faint creak drowned out by a burst of fireworks outside. Mrs. Patterson looked up, startled, her brow furrowed when she recognized who it was. "Adam?" she asked, adjusting her glasses and leaning forward in her chair. "What on—" Her words froze mid-sentence as he raised the gun. For a brief moment the panic in her eyes told him she understood. "You laughed," Adam said, his voice unflinching. "You talked. You made them all believe I was nothing." "Adam, wait!" she began, her voice trembling, but that was all she could manage before he pulled the trigger. The sharp crack of the gun echoed through the house, mixing briefly with the calm hum of her television, before silence swallowed the room. Adam left the house quickly, his breath coming in harsh gasps, every step heavier than the last, but there was no turning back. If anything, the act had solidified his resolve. His mind raced with the next name, Connie Miller. He heard her before he saw her. Even on a holiday evening, Connie's voice carried like a banshee through the quiet corners of Harlan. At the corner of Mason Street near the church parking lot she sat with a group of other women gathered around a picnic table. The faint smell of beer and barbecue lingered in the sticky night air as Connie leaned forward in her seat, laughing loudly at something one of the other women had said. Adam's blood boiled at the sound of her laugh. He knew that laugh. He had heard it echo behind him countless times at the diner, at the farmer's market, always accompanied by a quick glance in his direction, and then a whispered word to a friend. She had spread the story until it grew legs of its own, reaching every corner of the town. Obsession. That was the word she had put into everyone's mind. Adam walked toward the table. He didn't care that people were watching this time. How many times had they watched him before, smirking, mocking as he quietly endured their judgment? As he got closer, Connie finally noticed him, her laughter pausing as her eyes widened slightly. "Well, look who it is," she said, her voice laced with mock politeness. But there was a hesitation in her tone, a faint sense of unease. "What brings you out here, Adam? Come to enjoy the fireworks?" Adam didn't stop walking until he stood next to her chair. The other women fell silent, their conversation halting all at once as they sized him up. Adam's hand slowly moved inside his jacket. "Connie," Adam said evenly, staring down at her, "I've got something to say." Her smile faltered. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Adam pulled the gun out. The scream that erupted from one of the women nearby barely registered in his head as he pulled the trigger. Once, twice. Connie tumbled awkwardly sideways, her head hitting the edge of the table before collapsing onto the grass. The crowd around the picnic table scattered, screaming and ducking behind parked cars and benches as Adam turned to face them. His hands shook slightly now, his breathing ragged, but his eyes remained focused, cold and detached. He didn't fire again. Connie had been the target. The rest were irrelevant. "Now you know," he muttered under his breath before moving on. Edna, the waitress from the diner, was next. He found her exactly where he expected, standing behind the counter at Sullivan's Diner, refilling coffee for a few of the regulars who had gathered for a late-night chat after the fireworks show. The bell on the door jingled when Adam walked in, but no one paid it much mind at first. Edna didn't notice him until he was halfway across the diner, walking with steady, deliberate steps. "Well, if it isn't Adam Hayes," she said, her tone carrying her usual edge of sarcasm as she turned toward him with a coffee pot in her hand. But her face changed as soon as she met his eyes. The hardness she had used to mock him before melted into something else. Fear. Adam didn't say a word this time. He raised the gun in front of all of them, the old men at the counter, Edna, the busboy cleaning the far table. The sound of his shot shattered the relative quiet of the diner. The coffee pot slipped from Edna's hand, shattering against the tile floor as she collapsed behind the counter. The remaining customers scrambled for the doors, tripping over chairs and knocking into tables as Adam turned and left just as quickly as he had entered. The spree continued as Adam moved through the town like a dark shadow, striking with precision at the people he blamed for his humiliation. Houses on Sycamore Avenue that had once offered warmth and light were now filled with fear and confusion as neighbors locked doors and turned off porch lights. The festive atmosphere of Harlan's 4th of July celebration had been replaced with chaos, though many still didn't know the full extent of what was happening. By the time the first police sirens wailed in the distance, 10 people were already dead. Adam, with his weapon still in hand, disappeared into the streets and alleys he had walked his whole life. He was no longer seeking revenge, now he was only seeking the finale. The breathless pursuit. By the time the first police sirens pierced the warm 4th of July night in Harlan, Michigan, the town had already begun to descend into chaos. The sudden eruption of screaming, running, and doors slamming shut had shattered what should have been an idyllic celebration. Any illusions of small-town safety evaporated within moments as the grim reality of Adam Hayes' massacre set in. Neighbors whispered frantically through windows, parents yanked their children from the sidewalks and locked their homes for the first time in years. But the chaos on Sycamore Avenue and beyond was just beginning, because Adam Hayes wasn't done, not yet, and the police knew the only way to stop him would be in a direct confrontation. The first officers to arrive at Sycamore Avenue were utterly unprepared for what they found. Streaks of blood marked Catherine Moore's home and the houses beyond, and terrified witnesses could barely speak coherently between sobs. The fireworks still exploded overhead, casting haunting flickers of light over the devastation. As Lieutenant Mike Carlson stepped out of his patrol car, his gaze tracked upward toward the illuminated bursts lighting the sky. The irony of the colors overhead, red and white streaks cutting through blue darkness, did not escape him. "What in God's name?" Carlson muttered, crouching low as he carefully followed the trail of panicked neighbors pointing further downtown. Each incoherent cry and trembling explanation painted the same picture. Adam Hayes had lost it, had gone mad. He had targeted those he believed wronged him, and now he was armed, dangerous, and seemingly without any intent to stop. Carlson called for backup, his voice terse with controlled panic. "All units, we've got an active shooter, one subject known as Adam Hayes. He's left at least 10 dead so far. He's moving eastward. Suspect is armed, extremely dangerous. I need full tactical support now." By this time Adam was weaving through the side streets of Harlan. He knew the lay of the land better than anyone, every shortcut between backyards, every narrow alley between shops downtown, and every shadow he could slip into. For years, Harlan had been a cage to him, a town just waiting for him to trip up so its citizens could judge him more harshly. But now, it was his hunting ground. The fireworks overhead provided him with just enough camouflage, each burst of sound temporarily masking his movements. The crowd, already dispersing in fear, had scattered. This gave him one advantage. He no longer needed to blend in. From his hiding spot near the old park fence, Adam crouched low and looked around. The 2 pistols he carried now felt heavier than when he'd stolen away from home to begin his rampage hours earlier. His breath came in short bursts, but he managed to quiet it, keeping his ears open to the sound of distant shouting and sirens. He knew the police were closing in, but he wasn't finished. Not yet. "This is what you all deserve," he whispered under his breath, tightening his grip on the guns. "You did this to me. Every last one of you." But Adam's mind, already unraveling, was working against him. He hadn't anticipated how quickly the panic would ripple through the town, how fast people would barricade themselves inside their homes and disappear from the streets. His targets were no longer scattered throughout public spaces. They were hidden behind locks and curtains, fearful and silent, and so his spree, which had started with cold precision, gave way to frustration. The thrill of control was slipping from his grasp. Minutes later, Adam crossed a deserted alley behind Sullivan's diner, his eyes darting in every direction. He heard the low hum of a vehicle nearby, the slow crawl of a police cruiser. He froze, pressing his back against the wall as the cruiser's headlights swept across the street. Inside, a pair of officers scanned the area, armed and ready. Unlike Adam, patrol cops weren't used to combing through their town as if it were a battlefield. Their unease showed in the tense grip they maintained on their guns. "Do you see him?" one officer asked quietly, his voice low but trembling slightly. "No," his partner replied, his eyes darting into every darkened doorway along the street. "He's got to be close, though. They said he just went—" The sound of a faint clang, a trash can tipping over in the alley, made both officers whip their heads toward the source. For a fraction of a second they hesitated. That was all Adam needed. He stepped from his hiding spot and fired 2 shots in their direction. The bullets missed, but the flash and sound of the gunshots sent the officers diving for cover behind their vehicle. "All units! Officers under fire!" one of them shouted into his radio as Adam disappeared into the shadows, running now toward the edge of town. Chaos broke into a full-on hunt as more law enforcement arrived, spreading out in an effort to locate Adam. By now, Lieutenant Carlson and his team had cornered Adam's direction. They realized he was heading toward the woods that bordered the small town, Gaylord Forest. The woods were not unfamiliar to residents of Harlan, often a place for peaceful hikes or fishing along the banks of its winding streams. But at night, under the firework-punctuated sky, the forest transformed into something far more foreboding. The officers couldn't afford to lose him, not once he entered its sprawling network of trees and undergrowth. As Adam crossed the threshold into the forest, he felt a magnetic pull deep within him. He had spent time here as a kid with his father, long before the weight of rejection and loneliness had consumed him. Now the woods offered him exactly what he craved: isolation, freedom, and a battleground where he could control the narrative. The police weren't far behind. The whir of a helicopter's blades overhead joined the cacophony of sirens and shouting voices. Searchlights cut through the dense canopy, illuminating patches of ground in stark contrast to the dark shadows beneath the pines. From the road leading into the forest's edge, Carlson stood by his squad car with his radio pressed to his ear. "Move into position, but be cautious," Carlson ordered the officers fanning out ahead. "This guy's desperate. Desperate men make dumb decisions, but they're dangerous as hell." Inside the woods, Adam kept moving. The relentless noise of pursuit finally began to chip away at his confidence. For all his knowledge of the terrain, the reality of being cornered started to weigh on him. His breaths were shallow and he stumbled over the uneven ground as memories of his earlier spree overlapped with his growing panic. He saw Catherine's face again, her shocked expression before she fell. He heard the laughter of Connie Miller, louder and more mocking in his head. And then he heard the voices of the police drawing closer with every step. "Hayes! Adam Hayes! Drop your weapon and come out with your hands up!" One officer's voice boomed from a speaker. Laughing bitterly under his breath, Adam whispered to himself, "You think I'm done? I'm not done." Suddenly, the unmistakable roar of the helicopter overhead shone a spotlight directly on his position. Blinded by the intense light and deafened by the chopping of its blades, Adam stumbled again, this time losing one of his pistols as it slipped loose from his grip. They were closing in now. The sharp crack of a branch underfoot made Adam whirl around, pointing his remaining gun into the darkness. His finger trembled over the trigger, sweat dripping into his brow. He had planned for everything, except the feeling of being so outnumbered, so hunted. The officers pushed deeper, their flashlights bouncing like chaotic fireflies among the trees. For them, this wasn't just a pursuit, it was a race. They knew they weren't alone in the woods with Adam. Terrified residents were still at large, running in different directions, their cries barely breaking the stillness before disappearing into the forest's vastness. The final confrontation loomed ahead, a moment that would determine the true cost of one man's anger against an entire town. The final showdown. The night in Gaylord Forest was alive with noise, the sharp crackle of underbrush as police officers moved cautiously through the trees, the distant hum of the helicopter circling above, and the occasional boom of leftover fireworks still echoing through the air. But beneath it all was a suffocating silence, a tension so thick it seemed to press down on the shoulders of everyone involved. The town of Harlan, now a place of fear and disbelief, waited with bated breath as the hunt for Adam Hayes approached its inevitable conclusion. For Adam, the forest felt like both a sanctuary and a trap. The towering trees loomed overhead, their branches clawing at the black sky as if trying to keep the rest of the world out. His breath came in short, uneven gasps as he darted from shadow to shadow, clutching his remaining gun so tightly that the rough metal bit into his palm. Fatigue clawed at his body, but his mind, murky and broken, was alive with fury. His world had been torn apart, invaded and judged by the people in this town, and now they were here to finish what they had started. "They'll never take me," Adam whispered to himself, his voice trembling but resolute as he crouched behind a large oak tree. The helicopter's searchlight swept across the forest floor like a celestial predator, catching fleeting glimpses of roots, leaves, and patches of dirt. But never Adam. Not yet. The voices of the officers echoed faintly through the trees. "Adam Hayes, we've got you surrounded. Drop your weapon and come out peacefully." Adam smirked bitterly, the sound of their demands ringing hollow in his ears. "Peacefully?" he muttered under his breath. "You don't get to say that, not after everything." Lieutenant Mike Carlson crouched behind a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, his flashlight balanced precariously on the barrel of his rifle. He held the radio receiver close to his mouth, barking orders to the other officers spread out in the search grid. "Team Alpha, flank south around the creek bed. Team Beta, hold your positions on the ridge. Keep your eyes sharp. This guy knows the forest better than we do." Carlson's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the night pressing heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't just chasing a suspect. He was chasing a young man he had watched grow up, a boy he'd once seen at Little League games, cheering as his father fixed the engine on some old rusted-out car. And now that boy had become a killer, a shadow stalking through the woods with blood on his hands. "This didn't have to happen, Adam," Carlson muttered under his breath, gripping his rifle tighter. Deep in the woods, Adam moved like a predator stalking its prey, but his movements were becoming more erratic. The physical toll of the night was catching up to him. His legs ached, his vision blurred, and every sharp intake of breath felt like his lungs were tearing apart. Yet he refused to stop. In his mind he was no longer running from the police. He was running toward a moment of reckoning, a final statement that would echo far beyond Harlan. This wasn't about survival, this was about making sure his voice wasn't silenced. The breaking point came near a small moonlit clearing surrounded by dense pines. Exhausted and cornered, Adam knew he couldn't evade his pursuers much longer. He crouched low behind a cluster of ferns, his eyes scanning the area for movement. The beam of a flashlight swept dangerously close, and he heard the crunch of boots on the forest floor. The officers were closing in. "Hayes, listen to me!" one of the officers called, his voice steady but loud enough to echo through the trees. "It's over! There's nowhere left to run! Put the gun down and we can end this!" Adam's grip on the weapon tightened. "End this?" he hissed to himself. "You think this'll end?" "They'll just keep talking and keep laughing. Nothing ends until I say it does." He stood suddenly, his silhouette illuminated briefly by the helicopter spotlight sweeping overhead. The officers spotted him instantly. "There! He's in the clearing!" someone yelled. The forest exploded into action. "Put the weapon down, Adam!" Carlson shouted as he stepped into the clearing, his rifle raised but his finger not yet on the trigger. From the corner of his eye, he spotted two other officers moving to flank Adam, their flashlights casting long, eerie shadows against the pines. Adam turned sharply toward Carlson, his breath ragged, and pointed his pistol at the lieutenant. Carlson could see the tremor in Adam's arm, the sweat dripping down his pale face and the fiery desperation blazing in his eyes. This wasn't just a man ready to fight, it was a man with nothing left to lose. "Stay back!" Adam yelled, his voice cracking under the weight of it all. "You don't know what it's like! You don't— none of you—" His words broke off as he struggled to steady his breathing, his chest heaving like a caged animal. Carlson took a cautious step forward, lowering his rifle slightly. "Adam," he said calmly, trying to keep his voice steady. "It doesn't have to end this way. You've already done enough. You've made your point. Don't let this go any further." Adam's laugh was hollow, filled with bitterness. "My point?" he spat. "You think this is just about making a point? They pushed me. She pushed me. They all pushed until I had nothing left. And now I'm supposed to just— what? Walk away? Let you all win?" Carlson took another step forward, his boots crunching against the dry leaves. "Nobody wins here, Adam. You know that. But you can stop this before it gets even worse. Just put the gun down." For a split second, something flickered in Adam's eyes. Uncertainty, exhaustion, regret. Carlson couldn't tell, but whatever it was, it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Adam's grip on the gun tightened, and the trembling in his arm ceased. He raised the weapon, aiming directly at Carlson. "Don't do it!" Carlson shouted, his voice raw with urgency. The forest seemed to hold its breath. And then a single gunshot shattered the silence. The sound echoed through the trees, bouncing between the towering pines like the final note of some terrible symphony. Adam staggered backward, his pistol slipping from his hand and landing harmlessly in the dirt. His other hand clutched his chest, blood already staining his hoodie, as he sank to his knees. The officers rushed forward, their guns still raised but their movements careful. Carlson was the first to reach Adam, crouching beside him as he struggled to stay upright. Adam's eyes, once filled with rage, now looked hollow, lost. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat, reduced to a broken wheeze. "It didn't have to be this way, kid," Carlson muttered, his voice heavy with guilt. "It didn't have to end like this." Adam's lips parted and a single word escaped, a whisper so faint it was almost swallowed by the wind. "Why?" And then he was still. The clearing fell silent once more, save for the distant hum of the helicopter and the muted voices of the officers calling for medical support. But everyone knew it was too late. Adam Hayes, the boy who had grown up in Harlan, who had once been just another face in the crowd, was gone. As Carlson stood and looked around the darkened forest, the weight of the night settled fully on his shoulders. The tragedy didn't end here, and it didn't begin here either. It was born in years of whispers, judgment, and unspoken pain, festering wounds that no one had cared to notice until it was far too late. The final showdown was over, but the scars it left behind would haunt Harlan for years to come. The trial and the verdict. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with tension and the muted hum of whispers. The trial of Adam Hayes, dubbed the Harlan Massacre case by the national media, had captured the attention of the country. Small-town tragedies rarely stayed small in America. The shock of a massacre in a place as quiet and picturesque as Harlan, a town thought to be as quintessentially American as apple pie, had thrust its people, its history and its secrets, into the harsh, unforgiving light of public scrutiny. Though Adam himself had died at the end of that dreadful July night in the forest, the trial wasn't over. The focus had shifted to the aftermath, to understanding what had driven a quiet, unassuming young man to commit such unthinkable acts. The legal proceedings swirled around arguments of accountability, negligence, and the shadow that the town itself seemed unwilling to confront. More than justice, Harlan's people sought answers, believing that finding clarity might bring peace to a place that had suffered seemingly irreparable wounds. The courtroom spectacle. The trial unfolded not just in the courtroom but in the media frenzy that surrounded it. News vans lined the streets of Harlan, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Cameras flashed outside the courthouse, capturing glimpses of family members, witnesses, and legal teams as they came and went. Interviewers chased after anyone willing to talk, neighbors, friends, former teachers, even childhood acquaintances of Adam Hayes. Some interviews were heartfelt, full of pain, others were speculative, filled with bitterness and judgment. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. On one side sat the family members of Adam's victims, their faces etched in grief and quiet fury. Many wore pins with photos of their loved ones, reminders of the lives taken too soon. On the opposite side were Adam's father, Joseph Hayes, and a scattering of extended relatives who had come out of what felt like obligation. Joseph sat slumped in his chair, his features hollow, his hands trembling slightly as he clenched a handkerchief between them. He had aged 20 years in the span of 2 months. In the center of it all were the lawyers, locked in battle. Not over Adam's guilt, which was irrefutable, but over the larger questions left in the wake of his rampage. What responsibility did the town bear for what had happened? Could the signs of Adam's descent have been caught earlier? Had anyone paid attention as his mind unraveled? Or had the town of Harlan ignored him until it was too late? Prosecution, seeking justice. The prosecution carried the anger of the entire town on its shoulders. Their argument was simple and emphatic. Adam Hayes may have been troubled, but he had committed an act of premeditated evil, and his family, or anyone who had ignored his warning signs, should bear some of the blame. They painted a chilling portrait of a young man whose meticulous planning, from the acquisition of weapons to the list of targets, demonstrated cold and calculated intent. Do not allow sorrow and sympathy for his past to cloud the facts of this case, the lead prosecutor, Lisa McConnell, said during her opening statement. Her tone was sharp, unyielding as she pointed directly toward the jury. Adam Hayes murdered 18 innocent people. He shattered the lives of their families and left this town scarred. Troubled or not, he was responsible for his choices. There is no excuse for what he did. The prosecution brought out recordings of Adam's journals and notebooks, retrieved from his house after the massacre. Their pages were filled with chilling details, sketches of Sycamore Avenue, surveillance notes, and dark, rambling thoughts about Catherine Moore and the town's betrayal. Each scrap of paper painted a haunting picture of obsession and resentment, carefully nurtured over years. Witnesses testified to Adam's behavior in the months leading up to the attack. Co-workers described his growing isolation at the hardware store, his quick temper, and the day he stormed out after accusing his supervisor of conspiring against him. Catherine's friends spoke tearfully of the rumors that had swirled around her, rumors that painted Adam as obsessed and made her both a victim and, unfairly in some eyes, a scapegoat. But perhaps the most damning evidence were the survivors. A tearful child recounted Adam's cold, calm demeanor as he reloaded his gun at Catherine's house. A diner employee described the look in Adam's eyes before he shot Edna, the waitress, without a word. Each detail drove home the horror in the courtroom, reigniting the pain the town had tried to bury. The defense, a broken mind. In contrast, the defense painted Adam as a victim of his circumstances, a fragile mind crushed by years of neglect, trauma, and scorn. More than anything, they sought to shift the narrative from Adam's carnage to the societal failures that allowed it to happen. Adam Hayes was broken long before the events of July 4th, said his defense attorney, Richard Vaughn, his voice low but firm. And this isn't about excusing his actions, that's not why we're here. This is about understanding how he reached this point and why no one stopped it before it was too late. The defense called psychologists and mental health experts to the stand, each offering insight into Adam's troubled psyche. They detailed the trauma of his mother's death when he was just 13, the emotional absence of his grieving father, and the growing feelings of alienation that followed. Classmates described how he withdrew throughout high school, and co-workers testified to the strange, almost obsessive ways he latched onto any sliver of kindness, something that likely fueled his fixation on Catherine Moore. One particularly damning witness was Adam's former teacher, Mrs. Hendricks, who shared how she had raised concerns about his well-being during his sophomore year of high school. "He was a quiet boy," she said, wringing her hands nervously as she spoke, "but near the end of the semester he started drawing these violent pictures in the margins of his homework. I told the school counselor, but I was told that unless he threatened someone directly, there wasn't much we could do." Her voice cracked under the weight of the moment. "I should have done more." The defense also pointed fingers at the Harlan community itself. They highlighted the relentless gossip culture, the judgmental whispers that had followed Adam since his teenage years, and the pervasive rumors that twisted Catherine Moore's kindness into something salacious. Although these arguments didn't mitigate Adam's actions, they served to paint a broader picture of a system that had failed him at every turn. The aftermath. When the final verdict came, it was bittersweet. The jury deliberated for days, parsing through the arguments and evidence with painstaking care. In the end, there were no winners. Adam was dead, and justice could not undo the damage he had caused. The court ruled that Adam's father, Joseph Hayes, bore no legal responsibility for his son's actions. However, the town's officials faced harsh scrutiny for failing to intervene in clear warning signs. Lawsuits unraveled across Harlan over the next year, targeting the hardware store, the school district, and even local law enforcement. The scars of the massacre extended beyond the victims' families, tearing at the fabric of the community itself. For the town of Harlan, the trial was not just about assigning guilt. It was about understanding how it had all gone so wrong. Could Adam's rampage have been prevented? Could someone have offered him a lifeline? These questions lingered long after the court adjourned, haunting every resident who dared to linger on the days and years leading up to that fateful summer. A nation watching across the country, conversations began to spark. The case became a sensation, not just because of the violence, but because of the uncomfortable questions it raised about mental health, responsibility, and the quiet cruelty that can exist in small, tight-knit communities. Talk show hosts debated endlessly over who was to blame. Politicians used the tragedy to call for changes in gun laws, mental health funding, and school intervention programs. Harlan became a name synonymous with both tragedy and regret, a symbol of what happens when warnings are ignored, kindness is twisted, and desperation goes unnoticed. The trial itself may have ended with the verdict, but its impact would ripple for decades. Harlan would never again be the quiet, picturesque town it once was, and for better or worse, the name Adam Hayes would remain etched forever in its history books, a painful reminder of the darkness that can fester when pain and rejection are left unchecked. Lessons learned. The aftermath of Adam Hayes' rampage left Harlan, Michigan, forever changed. Its streets, once quiet and welcoming, now felt heavy with a lingering unease. The massacre did more than claim lives, it cracked open the facade of a perfect small town and revealed something far more uncomfortable hiding beneath. A culture of silence, judgment, and dismissal that allowed pain to fester until it erupted into tragedy. The lessons to be learned were painfully clear, even if the community and the country at large weren't always ready to face them. Harlan struggled to move forward. The loss of 18 lives cast a shadow over every familiar street, every porch light, every neighborhood barbecue. But those who remained, friends, families, neighbors, knew they couldn't go back to the way things were. To do so would be to repeat the same mistakes that had led to that fateful 4th of July. Change would not come easily, but the necessity of self-reflection loomed larger than ever. A town forced to reckon with itself. The residents of Harlan found themselves asking hard questions. How had this happened here, in their little corner of the world? How had no one seen the warning signs? Perhaps the most difficult question to grapple with was whether Adam's rampage could have been prevented. Neighbors who had dismissed Adam as weird or quiet now admitted, often in hushed tones, that they had seen glimpses of his struggles but thought it wasn't their place to intervene. Catherine Moore's friends, whose kindness had sparked rumors, questioned whether they should have confronted the gossip sooner, before it spiraled out of control. Teachers who had seen Adam withdraw in school revisited old memories, haunted by the feeling that they hadn't done enough to help him, and nearly everyone, those who had whispered, judged, or ignored him, wondered whether their small actions had unknowingly pushed him closer to the edge. "We thought we knew him," one neighbor said during a town meeting weeks after the tragedy, "but I guess none of us really did, and now we have to live with that." The sentiment reflected a wider truth. Harlan, for all its small-town charm and neighborly smiles, had failed to see Adam Hayes, to truly see him. This was a harsh reality for many to swallow. It was easier to put Adam's actions entirely on his shoulders, to label him a monster and distance themselves from the tragedy. But as the weeks turned into months, the town began to confront an uncomfortable truth. While Adam had pulled the trigger, the environment that bred his anger had been shaped, in part, by Harlan itself. The poison of gossip. One of the clearest lessons from the tragedy was the devastating power of gossip. In a town as small and interconnected as Harlan, rumors spread faster than wildfire, often without anyone stopping to question whether they were true. Words that were meant to be harmless, idle chatter on porches, speculative quips at the diner, had taken on lives of their own, transforming Catherine Moore's kindness into scandal and twisting Adam Hayes' strange behavior into something sinister long before it became reality. For Catherine, those rumors had cut deep, isolating her in the final weeks of her life. For Adam, they had been the final poison, proof in his mind that the town he had once called home had turned against him completely. "It's just talk," one resident, Connie Miller, had once told a neighbor defending Catherine, brushing off the harm of her own words. "It doesn't mean anything." But in retrospect, those words meant everything. The tragedy made it impossible to ignore the fact that gossip doesn't just vanish. It festers, it shapes perceptions, divides communities, and in the wrong circumstances, can even push fragile minds toward darkness. Harlan began to reckon with its culture of judgment and whispers. Town meetings became platforms for open discussions about the harm of idle words, challenging residents who had long equated silence with peace. Schools implemented anti-bullying programs not just for children but for parents, reminding everyone that kindness shouldn't be limited to those under the age of 18. One local pastor delivered a sermon titled "Deadly Echoes," condemning the idea that words could ever be harmless. These steps were small, maybe even too late, but they were a start. The importance of mental health. Perhaps the most glaring lesson was society's failure to recognize and address mental health issues before they exploded into violence. Adam Hayes had been hurting for years. Anyone who read his journals or heard the testimony from his childhood teachers understood that much. His turmoil didn't develop overnight. It was the result of accumulating pain, grief, and isolation, beginning with the death of his mother and worsening with every setback, rejection, and quiet judgment he faced. But what resources had been available to him? What safety nets existed to catch someone like Adam before he fell through the cracks? The answer, it seemed, was not enough. America's approach to mental health, particularly in small towns like Harlan, came under scrutiny in the wake of the massacre. Counselors were overburdened in schools, often prioritizing academic performance over emotional well-being. Social stigmas painted those who sought therapy as broken or weak, discouraging families like Adam's from addressing mental health problems head-on. There were signs in Adam's life: his withdrawal from friends, his fixation on Catherine, his paranoid behavior, but there had been no system in place to connect those dots until it was too late. The massacre became a rallying cry for better mental health awareness. Harlan's school district hired an additional counselor, and town officials established a community outreach program aimed at providing mental health resources to residents of all ages. Nationally, lawmakers used Harlan as an example to push for federal reforms, including increased funding for school psychologists and early intervention programs. For some survivors, these changes felt hollow. "What's the point now?" one grieving father asked during a town hall meeting, but others believed they were vital. "If we can stop this from happening somewhere else," another resident said, "then at least some good can come out of all this pain." Seeing the invisible. One of the deepest lessons from Harlan's tragedy was understanding the cost of invisibility. For years, Adam Hayes had walked the streets of Harlan unseen, not physically but emotionally. Teachers, neighbors, co-workers, they all noticed him but never truly saw him. His quiet presence made him easy to overlook, and his strangeness made it easier still to dismiss him as someone who simply didn't fit in. The massacre forced Harlan to rethink how it treated those who didn't easily blend into the crowd. Small acts of kindness, the very same that Catherine Moore had once extended to Adam, took on new meaning. Residents began paying more attention to the quiet ones, the lonely ones, the ones who might be struggling in silence. Schools encouraged students not only to report bullying, but to reach out to classmates who seemed isolated. See Something, Say Something campaigns expanded beyond physical safety to emphasize emotional well-being, urging people to reach out to those who might need help. It's not about saving everyone, one teacher explained during a community workshop, tears welling in her eyes. It's about making sure no one feels invisible. A national lesson. Harlan was no longer just a small town by the lake. It became a symbol, a name invoked in classrooms, town halls, and legislative chambers across the country whenever people wanted to highlight the dangers of inaction, ignorance, or unchecked pain. The name Adam Hayes, too, became a reminder, not just of violence but of the consequences of silence, of what can happen when a community turns its back on someone struggling within its embrace. National conversations about gun control and mental health funding surged in the years following the Harlan massacre. Politicians pointed to the tragedy as proof of the need for stricter firearm regulations, better-funded mental health resources, and widespread education on the signs of emotional distress. Debates were heated, solutions remained elusive, but one truth was undeniable. Harlan's pain was a warning, and the nation couldn't afford to ignore it. The lasting impact. Years after the massacre, Catherine Moore's porch light remained off, a haunting reminder of what Harlan had lost. But elsewhere, flickers of hope began to emerge. A neighbor stopped to help a struggling teen rake leaves from his yard. A teacher organized a mental health awareness week at the local school. Parents taught their children not to whisper behind other people's backs, reminding them that kindness costs nothing. The lessons Harlan learned came at a horrific cost, but those lessons carried the potential to create something better, not just in Harlan but anywhere similar dangers might be waiting to take root. The tragedy demanded more than sorrow, it demanded change, and slowly, painfully, that change began to take hold.